Before we start, I wanted to ask, and I will ask in a particular order for our panelists to just share a couple of words about themselves and their interest in this space. And Ms. Witkower, would you like to start to tell us a little bit about your interest in this space?
Sure. So hi, everybody. My name's Lucy Witkower, and I'm the head of teaching and learning initiatives at the ODU libraries. A lot of my research centers around teaching information literacy to undergraduate students. So it's really nicely aligned. Misinformation is a big concern in information literacy.
Thank you very much. Professor Brantley, would you like to share some thoughts?
Yes, thanks for having me. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Virginia Tech and the director of the Tech for Humanity Lab here. And I've been working in this space both as an academic and as a member of the Department of Defense.
Thank you very much. Dr. Purohit, some words from you.
Thanks, Ilya. Thanks for having me here. I'm assistant professor at George Mason University in information science and technology. And I have a humanitarian informatics lab, and I'm passionate about studying use of AI and technology, especially human-centered computing technologies for studying online behavior for social good. So misinformation clearly comes in that aspects.
Right, thank you. Professor Samoilenko.
Hello, my name is Serge Samoilenko. I'm assistant professor at George Mason University as well. I'm in the Department of Communication. I'm the co-founder of the Research Lab for Character Assassination and Reputation Politics. So this is an international and interdisciplinary lab that studies different issues in character assassination, reputation management, crisis communication, and basically we do all kinds of things from organizing conferences to writing books, textbooks, and also doing research and consulting in different areas from politics to climate change.
And I think just in a few minutes we have realized just the variety of expertise that this particular topic brings to us. And Ms. Witkower, if you don't mind, I wanted to start with you asking you sort of a question to kick off this discussion. So when we think about identifying misinformation and disinformation, we sort of need to establish what kind of information is true and what information is false, which is probably the billion-dollar question. It's hard to do. Who ends up being the arbiter of this kind of decisions?
Okay. Yes, I do agree. It's a difficult challenge that's become even more challenging as our information ecosystem continues to evolve. And as we know, information is not always true or false. It's sometimes somewhere in between, or it's a partial answer that we then synthesize with other information, or the information, what we know to be true, is changing in that very moment. So when thinking about determining what information is true and what information is false, we also need to think about the context of the information. The differences between disinformation and misinformation often come down to intent, and both types of information often have elements of truth to them. Intent also changes as information evolves or is passed along. For example, we may have a really sound set of data on a topic, but a poorly formed data visualization can quickly turn that research into misinformation, even though the information that is being presented is technically true. Even satire, a form of disinformation, that's intended to be funny and is usually not true, can teach or tell us something that is true or pass along important information among groups of people. And we've seen entire disinformation campaigns that were based in truth, but the presentation of the information and the intent behind it made it false or inaccurate. Even prior to fake news becoming a term commonly used, students have been regularly taught to evaluate sources using checklists or processes that focus mostly on author and source credentials. And that leads us to the question of, is this a good source or is this a bad source? In K-12, students often learn that they shouldn't use or trust Wikipedia, but something that's behind a paywall that provides the same or less information is okay, simply because of the bias about the source of the information, and not really examining the content of the information or considering the context of the information need. So when I talk to my students about disinformation and misinformation and evaluating sources, I've moved away from the term source evaluation to source examination to clarify that we're not necessarily judging a source as good or bad or true or false, but we're looking at it in its context and within the framework of the information need. So I think the second part of your question was, who is the arbiter of information? That's a difficult one. And I agree with what Louise said earlier, that this is an issue that requires multidisciplinary expertise. I don't think that any one group of experts can be the gatekeeper of this knowledge. And we need to work across disciplines to both combat misinformation and disinformation, and to teach others how to examine information that they encounter in their lives. And that's why initiatives and grants like this are so important. And I'm excited that you all are doing this. I'm looking forward to seeing some of the great things that come out of it. I think that when talking to our students and the general public about this issue, we can talk about individual responsibility when it comes to using, creating, and sharing information, but we can't place all of the responsibility on the end user. So I think that's something that some of these projects might explore. We can't place those of us with more knowledge in topics like information literacy, cybersecurity, and all the disciplines that are coming together have a responsibility to contribute to teaching people how to be responsible arbiters of information through things like product development, teaching, the way that we're reporting news, the research that we're doing, et cetera. And others have a responsibility to act upon that knowledge.
So really a two-way process, and you said a couple of words that I will borrow with your permission and then bring them to the class that I'm teaching. What I really liked is this last comment about responsibility, and for those of, I see that I've got some students in the audience, I'm terribly excited by that. I've got quite a penchant for splitting the difference between responsibility and accountability. So the ability to explain, and I think explainable AI, I see sort of colleagues on this panel, is something that is acquiring ever greater importance also in the context of this kind of work. But I wanted to sort of tie back into something that Louise was telling us at the beginning, in terms of the focus of CCI, of which cybersecurity is one of the components. And Professor Brantley, if I might sort of turn to you. So cybersecurity, autonomy, and data are at the core of the objective of CCI. To what extent do you think that the spread of disinformation and misinformation becomes a cybersecurity problem? And to what extent might we have cybersecurity target in this space? Do you think there are certain technical disciplines that can help us in this particular context?
Well, there's no doubt that disinformation, misinformation, and cybersecurity are intimately related in the modern usage and context in a lot of ways. A few years back, I took a special team to Ukraine to work on this, and what we see is the use of cybersecurity vulnerabilities and hacking to get into Ukrainian information systems, and then use that information that they collected to distribute it out and engage in disinformation and misinformation campaigns by taking what was privileged information and manipulating it in certain ways. And so that leads to a chain of custody of information and data manipulation, which leads to more robust, substantial disinformation and misinformation campaigns. And so you can see that oftentimes, creating things out of thin air is very difficult for disinformation and misinformation. It does happen, obviously, but oftentimes these types of campaigns are much more robust when you use privileged information that is stolen through cybersecurity means or other types of mechanisms. This issue also came up substantially. I was one of the senior experts on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission to define US cyber strategy. And there we really grappled over where disinformation and misinformation really fit into US cybersecurity and cyberspace strategy. And it eventually ended up getting actually left out of the overall strategy. That being said, it was left out not because people didn't recognize that there was an inherent cybersecurity challenge of both using automated means and tools, AI, ML, and other types of resources to identify and assess dis and misinformation or provenance of information, but rather because identifying and leveraging technical tools for pure cybersecurity, for keeping people out of computer systems, is fairly politically uncontroversial. But when you start using those types of systems to start engaging in arbitration of information or the provenance of that information, it becomes much more politically sensitive and complicated on everything from vaccines to political to every other type of issue that can get involved. And so in terms of assessing cybersecurity, where cybersecurity fits in, it fits in essentially hardening or making it more difficult to use that privileged information that people wish to keep confidential or maintain integrity on that information so that it doesn't get into the information ecosystem as a whole. And that in and of itself can be a very substantial way to reduce the effectiveness of disinformation, because it essentially makes the people engaging in dis and misinformation do more work. And so that's one way of thinking about it. So.
Thank you very much. And perhaps then, again, we go back to what Luis was telling us. We look the cybersecurity side, and Professor Purohit, I'd like to look at the AI side, so to speak. Can AI, and if so, how is AI used to both spread misinformation and disinformation, but also combat the same?
So, yeah, I think this is still a very big open research question in the space of technical research as well. So there are a couple of ways, if you broadly categorize the kinds of methods, they can be content-centric, they can be user-centric, who is the consumer of information, and they can be actually also network-centric, which kind of relates with the sources who are propagating this type of information. And research has been done where people have seen the use of these deep learning techniques, especially generating those deep fakes that you would have heard of some point about manipulated content. So what Aaron was just mentioning a while ago about partial truth, that there is some legitimate info, and you just club together with that fake information. And then basically, if you propagate it, it is very difficult to detect for the methods which are in place. For content-based methods, as well as it's also it's basically also easy to spread as well, because people buy into that trust factor, because there is some legitimate info also being passed along with that fake information. So that is basically one hard challenge that is there, which basically for two sides of the same coin, that you use that as a means to spread, and then there is also counterbalance in terms of detecting this kind of content. So that is like one area where there has been, you can say, misuse of AI for spreading this kind of content. There are also works which basically rely upon thinking of coordination games. If we think about like approaches in game theory, for instance, where the way agents are working, people have also explored those type of approaches to figure out best mechanisms to inject information in the networks. What are the best places to spread the maximum flow in a given network for this disinformation, right? So there are problems of that nature as well, where research has gone into. And then basically for users, you try to find out who are the most vulnerable users, right, in terms of spreading, but you flip the coin in terms of combating. You are interested in finding out then who are these malicious users, in terms of these bots, in terms of legitimate users, but because they are too much influenced by certain agenda or certain propaganda that they are interested in. So in the combating side, that becomes the flip side for that. In the combating side, in terms of content, interestingly, earlier my colleague mentioned about intent. So that is like what my background work has been, where we have done this kind of study where people use these mechanisms of intentions to undermine policies. Policies related to curbing gender-based violence. So there are laws and there are policies, but why they are not very effective? And because there is this, this kind of counter narrative that is spreading in the network with the means of the earlier strategy that was in place, that mixture of partial truth versus plus fake information, as well as the kind of content that is persuasive in nature, the kind of content that is basically accusing. If you 10 times accuse someone, if one doesn't have enough context of a topic, one starts to believe, like somebody would start to believe into and buying into that type of information, right? So there is that kind of malicious intention of accusing, sensationalizing, validating this type of mixture of legitimate and illegitimate content. So this is the kind of works like we have done, and intent detection is kind of one mechanism, of course, from content side in AI that one can look for in natural language understanding methods. So that's there in terms of like the three meta categories of methods, which could be either side of the coin.
And to some extent, you do to AI what Ms. Whitcower does to students, right? It's teaching the differences, is taking away the judgment and emphasizing the analytical modeling to process.
And it is important to earlier point that was being made about education. It is so very much important to really teach our students to understand this misuses of these technologies, state-of-the-art technologies.
And this is not, as much as we, I think as human beings, we like to be the main characters of the drama that is going on right now. So we feel that this is all terribly new. But Professor Samoilenko, to what extent this is actually the problem with disinformation and misinformation a new problem, or perhaps is an existing problem, but there are some technologies that are making it a new problem?
It's a great question. Thanks for asking. In fact, it's not a new thing, and it was a lot of research done in the especially post-Cold War area based on all the techniques used during the Cold War by different nations engaging in what they call active measures and operations. And they also used a lot of different disinformation techniques, of course. However, I would like to mention what Lucinda said was really, really important about the context and the changing climate of that and technology that makes the spreads and proliferation of that misinformation possible. And so as a research lab, we started off as basically an entity looking at some, bad guys who are trying to do some hit job and destroy other people's reputations. And then we realized, but sometimes some contexts are very complicated. For example, this what we call kind of psychological view focusing on intentionality and cause and effects does not always explain for example, cases when both, attacker and the target responsible for the effects of this interaction, right? Or they can simultaneously exchange in attacks and defenses, and they constantly might adjust those strategies, and they're looking for public support and so on and so forth. So we basically realized that we really have to look at also context and how the media ecosystem has changed in recent years, just to explain why it has become so conducive to incivility, character assassination, misinformation, fake news, you name it. For example, 24/7 news cycle has become a Twitter cycle, right? And now it requires constant news supply. So what we call clickbait content is always based on sensational headlines, which are highly profitable and really benefit like some talented manipulators and newsmakers. Like in 2017, for example, Antonio Scaramucci leaked information with the New Yorker Ryan's Lisa and been viewed like 4.4 million unique visitors in 4 days, right? And like those 10 days made him a big star and a big draw, like in a public speaking circuit. So this demand for constant information, in fact, really affected the information we received, right? And really affected our what we call news metabolism, right? So at this point, it's all about who is the fastest one. So this velocity of news has created what we call the tyranny of speed over accuracy, right? So at this point, we have also the ecosystem that creates all kinds of things like such echo chambers. So people not only have different opinions anymore, well, they have different facts, well, or perceived facts, right? And we also have to study those situations. So what about media fragmentation? So we have all kinds of media now that pretty much cater to their own audiences. We have to look at tabloid journalism and television entertainment. And in the recent years, what we call tabloid news and humorists, comedians have become really, really important. I mean, sometimes they provide all kinds of biased information, but that's what the public's like. They like this first-hand information that is entertaining, so they consume this information instead of looking for some facts and some things that require some real cognitive effort. So I believe that we really need to spend more time looking at context, because it's really important, and we have to ask ourselves, how did we come to this point where we have such a media ecosystem with new technologies that constantly equip people with malicious intent to do all kinds of things, including staging scandal, spreading misinformation campaigns, or being able to kind of manipulate our public discourses.
And I think that malicious intent can be, there's sort of the educated malicious intent, which is the hard one, because it tries to subtly nudge things away. And then there's just the stupid, uneducated, I've got nothing better to do than try to spin something off my whatever account because I want to see how many clicks I get in the next 10 minutes or whatever it is. And so again, we go back to context, because also identifying that intent gets ever more complicated by understanding sort of where it sits. Now, I'd like to open, we've got 10 minutes, I'd like to open sort of the opportunity for questions. And there is actually one, Professor Brantley, that is for you, if I may ask. The member of the public wanted to go back to your Ukrainian example and wanted to, or incident, and wanted to ask whether you could give us some examples of misinformation and disinformation in that particular context. And if you could speak about a little bit about some of the consequences of that situation.
Yeah, so I wrote a report on this for the Defense Department, and I actually wrote 2 reports on it for the Defense Department that came out, one from the Modern War Institute and one from Army Cyber. And what we found was that they were using cybersecurity vulnerabilities in, one example is they were using cybersecurity vulnerabilities in Android systems and leveraging Android Jack to hijack soldiers' phones. And then they would jump into the communication stream between the soldier and his family and actually send text messages and other types of information back and forth to the spouse or the children of the soldier, telling them that they were dead. And then they would also use those same devices to geolocate and lay fire on those individuals. But they would also manipulate information systems across across Ukraine to try and pick apart various different types of information stories. And we actually saw Ukrainians doing the exact same thing back. There's a group called Informed Napalm in Ukraine that was actually known for hacking into Russian servers and taking data and then spilling information and misinformation associated with Russia. And then we saw counter information operations from a variety of different organizations such as Stop Fake and others. This is not just obviously a Ukrainian or other phenomenon. I've spent time in the Middle East with special forces doing the same work, and I've built AI programs to work for those types of applications as well. And we see a lot of the same things occurring in a variety of different contexts. And so we can think about disinformation in the Ukraine context as targeting both societal level, but it can also target individual level types of activities. So there's not, we oftentimes consume the modern concept of dis and misinformation as a societal level impact, but there are also very individual level impacts that can occur, particularly against targeted individuals or groups of individuals or ethnic or other minority groups as well.
And the ripple effects are are then magnified. So it can even start at a very small level, but then it sort of ripples out to a greater group. There's a question that is directed to Professor Samoilenko, but I think I'd be interested to also hearing Ms. Wickower take on the same. So the question is whether if both of you could comment on cognitive bias in science that may influence information and disinformation, dissemination and interpretation. So to what extent does cognitive bias, which we all have to deal with in our own disciplines, have an impact in the dissemination and interpretation of the two?
It's a great question, actually. It plays a major role. So I study communication, and I look also at different techniques used in communication practices to, let's say, destroy reputation of some public individuals or organizations. Like, for example, we study social labeling, naming. We look at how social labels associate a person with kind of set of unwanted characteristics that produce certain bias, such a horn effect, which may lead to negative stereotypes and stigmatize the target. So we also work with psychologists who look at different types of stigmatization practices and how they, in different cultural contexts, might actually overlap with certain stereotypes people might have about other individuals or about other nations. So for example, stigma may contribute to like more negative impressions by producing different associations. And of course, it's really important to study those things. But there are a lot of what we call kind of illusion biases that are studied in psychology and social sciences, from like horn effects to framing and many others. So there are hundreds and hundreds of them. But so that's why I think it's really important to use multidisciplinary research, because we can all educate each other.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. When I talk to my students about cognitive bias and confirmation bias, the echo chamber that Sergey mentioned earlier is really important to be aware of. And I think when we're looking at issues like what's happening right now with the COVID-19 vaccine, for example, that would be a really interesting area of research, an important area of research to explore, is how cognitive bias is impacting people's decisions about whether or not to get the vaccine or whether or not to wear a mask and those sorts of things. I wanted to circle back to something that Professor Brantley said about the individual impact of misinformation and disinformation. And all of the topics that we're mentioning, climate change, politics, healthcare, those are all really important to pursue. I also think that in addition to topics, it would be really interesting if one of these projects looked at the population groups that are most impacted by disinformation and misinformation. It's been well documented that marginalized groups and poor people are the most impacted by this issue. And that kind of feeds into our problems with healthcare and finances and criminal justice. And so I think that would be a good direction for one of the projects to go in. Sorry, I went a little bit off topic.
No, actually, you brought us right back on
okay.
Thank you. I am conscious of time, and I know there's a couple of questions that are coming up. So if I could invite the members of the audience to sort of then direct them directly to you, because I wanted to do is a little spectacular thing that I like doing at the end of seminars or podcasts. I'm going to ask everybody just the same kind of question, which is always sort of fairly hypothetical. If you could pick a colleague from another discipline to engage in a project that you are presenting for this specific call for proposals, which discipline would this colleague come from and why? Professor Purohit, maybe we start with you with your thoughts.
Sure. So I think pretty much any field, would be impacted by this pandemic, right? When we can think of business to all the way healthcare system is not the only one that was impacted, right? Businesses have been impacted too. So to me personally, I would, thinking broadly, I would like to go with people who are studying these government and administrative processes. So that is for me, because largely I'm interested in the ultimate beneficiary being public. So how things are being administered and all. And so I'm interested in that, like my personal opinion.
Thank you. Professor Samoilenko, what would be your ideal partner?
Well, that's really hard. I don't want to discriminate. So I'm currently working on a very interesting study looking at how contrarian think tanks use different types of strategic disinformation and character attacks on climate change scientists. So what we can do about them and how we can inoculate the audiences, including students, against some of those deliberate attacks. So I would love to work with people from IT and maybe information, other artificial intelligence, so to expand my horizons. So maybe that may be overlooked by me as a social scientist and person representing humanities.
Thank you. Professor Brantley, how about you?
Sorry, I lost my mouse. No, I feel really fortunate. I feel like I found part of my dream team in actually the person who just asked the question on the Q&A section. Kurt Luther and I and David Hicks have been working on a open source for good, OSINT for good project that we're developing, and I think that Kurt is a humble guy, but he works a lot at the intersection of AI and crowdsourcing, and then also David works in the School of Education, and so I think that this combination of basically everybody who's on the panel, right? So we have AI, we have people who focus on the politics and the education and everything along those lines, and really emphasizing. For me, obviously, I'm a political scientist, so I'm very interested in the political and social ramifications associated with these different types of things, which can include health as well. But I think that pulling together a multidisciplinary team and picking an issue that everybody on that team can get behind and be passionate about, and having that diversity of thought and really stepping out of discipline, but still maintaining a foot inside that discipline to provide that perspective is very important.
Ms. Wickower, how about for you?
Sure. So, and in my role as a librarian, I work with faculty from a lot of different disciplines, and I kind of have a broad view of what all of the disciplines are doing. So it's been really interesting to work on a couple of cybersecurity projects. I recently collaborated with someone from philosophy and someone from computer science, and the three of us were able to put together a really interesting team and a really good project. We had ethics, and we had the computer science knowledge and the information literacy and teaching. So I'm interested in those types of collaborations. I also think it would be interesting to collaborate with someone from psychology and focusing on kind of the confirmation bias and self-efficacy and ability to evaluate information would also be interesting.
Thank you. And let me just plug in something. We lawyers have got something to contribute to. We're not great fun, but we can do something. I think that this gives us the opportunity for Luis perhaps to close this fantastic seminar. Luis.
Thank you, Iria. And I'll just be brief because I know that we are at time. First of all, thanks to Lucy and Sergey and Hemant and Aaron and Iria. I could listen to you guys for another hour easily or more on this topic. I think a lot of the questions from the audience have been fantastic. And it's great to see that there is already such expertise on the topic in Virginia. So hopefully this call just potentializes that and makes that into something bigger. Since I've joined CCI, I think the most exciting thing about CCI is really breaking these barriers between universities and between disciplines. So, a panel like today is just so exciting to see, people from all these different universities with something different to contribute. And I think it really makes us in Virginia much stronger as an academic community. So I'm really excited about today's panel. So thank you so much. And thanks to all our attendees. I am sure we'll get some fantastic proposals and projects out of this. So have a great weekend, everyone.